Hello, my name is Nick Perez, and for my place-based learning assignment, I have decided to talk about the Waltham Watch Factory, a staple of Waltham, Massachusetts. The Waltham Watch Factory, the Waltham Watch Company was founded by Aaron Lufkin Dennison in 1850, but it wasn't always the Waltham Watch Company. Initially, they opened their first factory in Roxbury, Massachusetts, which is in Boston, so they were the Boston Watch Company. However, after needing more space for the factory as the company continued to grow, they moved out here to Waltham, where they initially owned 100 acres of land, which was big enough to build this iconic brick building where they would produce all of their watches. The Waltham Watch Factory is considered by some to be the birthplace of American industrialization, taking place around the same time that we had the Lowell Mills. And to make these watches unique and different, what Dennison did was go to England and study the trade secrets of how English watches were made at the time. What he noticed was that there was not a lot of mechanization throughout the process of making English watches. And so he decided that that would be what would set the Waltham watch apart from other watches. As a result, he moved away from the artisan model of watchmaking, where one individual would make most of all of the components of the watch, and towards a more assembly line production of watches, which would later go on to inspire Henry Ford, who is famous, of course, for being the first auto manufacturer to implement assembly lines and making his Ford Model T. Waltham watches at the time were very expensive. They were considered to be luxury timepieces, and so the company struggled to regain its capital effort. They would spend a lot on making the watches, and then not a lot of people would have the money to be able to buy the watches. And so they started to make cheaper watches, which became very popular amongst Union soldiers during the Civil War. And in fact, Abraham Lincoln became the owner of a Waltham Model 1857, which was given to him in celebration of his Gettysburg Address, and Waltham watches would become synonymous with the Union effort throughout the Civil War. Later, as we go towards the turn of the 20th century, the Waltham Watch Company worked in collaboration with scientist Nikola Tesla to develop speedometers for early Rolls-Royce, Lincoln, and Ford model cars. As time went on, the Waltham watches gained more and more notoriety, but continued to struggle for money, as the same issues which had plagued them from the beginning, the luxury watchmaking, and the process and money which that took the money that it took to create luxury watches that were up to the Waltham standards would often not be reciprocated in those who would buy them. There was not a market for these type of watches. However, one person who was in the market was Charles Lindbergh, who wore an XA Type 37 on the Spirit of St. Louis, which guided him on the first ever transatlantic flight from New York to Paris. Lindbergh was not the only explorer or record setter who enjoyed Waltham watches. Also, Ronald Rolfs, Charles Kingford Smith, Robert Perez, and Ernest Shackleton. Waltham watches also became synonymous with the railroads. Waltham Railroad watches were selected by railroad companies in 52 countries. And by the time that the railroads were in their golden age, there were more Waltham watches in the world than all other brands put together. All told, the initial Waltham Watch Company, which existed from 1850 to 1957, made 40 million timepieces, which made it the world's largest watch brand, as we would say. Waltham watches became the standard for F4s at the Navy's Top Gun Academy, and leaders in American industrialization were often seen wearing Waltham watches throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, we've alluded to this, but why would such a prominent watch factory shut down and become luxury apartments? Well, the prices that it took to make these luxury watches and the amount of care and level that put into them were renowned among the watch world. The Waltham watch famously influenced how Swiss watches were made after its creation. However, this made it difficult for there to be a market to sell them in, and as such, the company struggled financially for a long time. Now, throughout the multiple wars that the company existed through, the Civil War, which we've already mentioned, as well as World War I and World War II, the Waltham Watch Company would receive subsidies from the government in order to create watches which could be worn by soldiers and generals and could be in planes, as we talked about with the F4s. But sadly, this would not be enough. During the 1930s, they went through some very tough times, which were papered over by the contracts that would come from the participation in World War II in the 1940s. But by the 1950s, the company was unable to continue production. Again, in large part due to their costs and the luxury nature of these watches, despite the fact that they were assembly line watches. After 1957, multiple different iterations of the Waltham watch brand have come and gone. But the original Waltham Watch Company only existed for about 100 years, but left behind this beautiful factory, which turned into these luxury apartments that you can see in front of you today. Thank you so much for listening to my place-based learning, and I hope you all learned something and enjoyed it.